Aya. Te pewe neola kakoke wa hanungi kakikwe. Nila Myaamia metosenia me shikia wenswa ane. Tenjewa takamwa nehe palanaswa ewe makike. As Daryl said, my name is George Ironstrack. It's very good to see everyone here this morning. Thank you for coming out to listen to all of us, and thank you especially to tribal leadership and Myaamia community members for coming and reflecting with us. Today I'm going to talk about reflections on language teaching, and then how that expanded more broadly to teaching things that belong to the whole community, beyond just language, which Wes did a very good job of talking about social contexts. The title of my talk today is miloniteeheetaawi, eehinki, pimihkanaweeyankwi. Let us reflect on how far we have traveled. And it is meant to be inclusive. I, like Wes, am notorious for going way over my time, but I hope that this starts a conversation within our community about the direction of our education, the needs of our people today. We began the actual teaching efforts in the Myaami tribe in 1996, and we're using today to begin to reflect on that. And of course, our situation has changed and our needs have changed. So we want to get a conversation started in the community about that. As I reflect on my journey, and a lot of this is going to be personal, and it's going to be focused on the Myaamia Project. And there are lots of other people who have been a part of this effort, and there are lots of other groups engaged in different kinds of teaching efforts. Mine's going to be focused on my own experience and the origins of the Myaamia Project. And when I look at our teaching strategies, when I look at our content today, what I see is a very much a present-focused people who are drawing on our past experience. And in our present lives, we use lots of tools, pedagogical tools, teaching tools, theoretical tools, as well as technical tools, like this telescope here that Tim and the youth are using at Ewan Zapata in Oklahoma to look at the night sky, to look at a night sky that has been consistent over our heads throughout our lives as a community. So if you think about people who've experienced 2 forced removals, in each of those removals, the night sky didn't really change over our heads too much. And the stories, another kind of tool, that's how I view them, a philosophical tool embedded in that night sky, traveled with us. And so while we use new technology like a telescope to look at that night sky, what we're looking at hasn't changed all that much, except for the light pollution. And the stories connected to them, those that we've maintained, are still with us. And so it's this interweaving of past and present with a focus on the future that continually drives my thinking about teaching. Personally, for me, to go back to the origins of the teaching that the Myaamia Project does today, I go back to Ashipekawawalichi, 7 Pillars, which lies just outside Peru, Indiana, in Myaamiaki, in what was the Great Miami Reserve, and was a part of the heartland of Miami lands for generations, and Miami people still live in that area to this day. And in 1995, we began the first community language camps. And these were organized and supported by the Miami Nation of Indiana. Critical support. They owned the land upon which the first camp began, and they provide a lot of the resources. For instance, they had the facilities for showering, which were vital for survival and a whole week of camping out. The very important things that appear menial, but they're not. They're the functions of community: water, garbage, some food. But they were also community organized, so that the education was focused on families. Whole families camped out for the whole week, and whole families learned together. Sometimes segregating kids from adults, but oftentimes the education taking place mixed together. And families also just pitching in money, pitching in work, to do the cooking, to put together the meals, to put together the activities. A lot of organic planning. As Daryl said last night, we like to do it first and then create documents later, and that is true of our educational work as well. This is also the beginning of our learning lessons about education. So it was the first time for Daryl to try and teach the language to a broader group of people. He had already been working within his own family, and he had been studying linguistics at university. And it was his first time to take that experience and that knowledge and to try and inject it into a community context. And he and I talked about this and reflected on it the past couple weeks. And that coming out of a linguistics environment, he then continued down a linguistics path in terms of teaching. So we literally had a chalkboard in the woods. I have it in quotes as an idea, but it literally was a chalkboard in the woods on an easel made out of branches, and it was a piece of chalkboard from the school building where Myaami's, where their government offices sit. And Daryl taught the Myaamia language by writing on a chalkboard, and people learned by reading and writing. To a certain extent, even the older kids were reading and writing Myaamia. And that was our first exposure to it, through the written word and through trying to learn pronunciation using the Roman alphabet plus a few other characters. In addition to that experience of families coming back, of learning the Myaamia language, what we also saw was the beginnings of something that I think later on transformed the efforts. And that was that the experience of Myaami people coming together in the context of learning our language created a sense of home that was new and different. So many of the participants were from that area. They visited Seven Pillars all the time. But coming there to do this as a group made the sense of home different. And we also learned that you have to try, and then you have to make mistakes. And then you have to correct those mistakes and learn from mistakes and then try again. So it's not about being perfect the first time. If you're obsessed with being perfect the first time, you'll never get anything started. You have to go, and then you revise, and then you go, and then you revise. As Daryl said last night, you look back, you reflect, and then you move forward a little bit, and then you look back and you reflect and you move forward a little bit. And that's one of the most important lessons that I drew away from this experience. The next step in, I think, the development of the strategies and teaching practices that today are embodied in the Myaamia Project began the very next year in 1996 in Zhongisipiwikinundewe at the Myaami Tribe Longhouse in the Neosho River Valley outside Miami, Oklahoma. And the Myaami Tribe had successfully received an Administration for the Native Americans grant to begin to train teachers. And so the focus of this activity was to take adults and to train them to be teachers, following many of the same strategies and practices that Gerald used the year before in Peru. And so you can see the room is full of mostly adults. There are some kids who are participating from time to time, but the focus was here, for the most part, on adults. Very shortly after that, many of those adult teachers began to teach kids workshops in the same location. I don't believe it occurred that year, but it occurred very shortly after in the years following. And these were more activity-based, so we moved away from the chalkboard model for kids and more towards doing activities like Wes showed with the Little Red Riding Hood and Papangamo play. While the adults oftentimes were inside still doing the chalkboard style activities. So you begin to see a division in the teaching strategies. The other major difference with this program and the program in Peru is that this was a daytime program, so people were not camping out there. They were going back either to hotels or to their homes. And that changes the amount of energy and work that goes into organizing the event, but it also changes the kind of community that's experienced. It's a part of the trial and error. There's a benefit and there's a cost, and you have to look back on both of those and reflect on what those things achieve and whether they're sustainable as well. I was not there in 1996, but what I perceived happening shortly after that, really in both locations, I went to Oklahoma after 1996, and I went to the camp in Peru for years afterwards, is that the chalkboard model didn't work for adults as much as we thought it would. And we produced a lot of people who could read and write Myaamia. They could write emails to each other, they could write letters, but they couldn't pronounce it necessarily, they couldn't speak it, or even read it off the page sometimes. And they weren't using it in conversation, not even in simple greetings. People were using aya and other short terms, but they weren't using longer functional questions. And that wasn't, as Wes says, a judgment of grammatical, achieving some level of grammatical fluency. But we all knew that there had to be a spoken form. It couldn't just exist on paper. And the teaching through the chalkboard wasn't working for adults. Well, we watched the kids who were learning through activity, learning through doing, interacting with language while they're engaged in activity, began to pick up the language very, very quickly. Of course, a part of the difference is the child's mind, the complete focus and attention a child can give, and the difference in brain development, especially with those younger than 6. But a part of it we also found was the teaching techniques being used. The next place that I really see a major development in our teaching strategies and our content really began here, Myaamia Mission Nippon at the big Miami school. That's how we refer to this place. And here we began to consciously intermix. We still use the chalkboard model. We still use classrooms, as you can see here, a class discussion, although you can see there's nothing written on the whiteboards in this case. We do use them, and we write on them, and we do write out the Myaamia language. But we also meet out in places like this. This is near the pond on Western Campus to talk about ecology. We're not going to talk about ecology in a classroom. We're going to go to the wonderful places that exist on campus that are full of all the trees and plants that are native to Myaamiaki and educate about ecology there. We actually educate about history in the context of ecology as well. So it all occurs out on the land when the weather is suited to it. And you notice I did not feel the need to prop up a chalkboard. We abandoned the chalkboard in the woods. As Daryl and Julie did a really good job of retelling the story, this ability to create an environment here to experiment, to begin with new kinds of trial and error, goes back to the legacy of the 1970s and Chief Forestall's beginning to build that relationship and plant the first seeds. So it didn't come out of nowhere. But its real increased growth began in 2001 in terms of the teaching strategies, the pedagogical practices, and the underlying content, the expansion of the content way beyond just language, into history, ecology. And then took off again in 2003 when we began the Heritage Award classes. For students here on the Heritage Award, they began to take class, and they began to take on the status of guinea pigs. And I say that with a smile on my face, but we really do look to our students as a place where we engage in trial and error. We try things out with them, and we ask them about what they thought about that experience, about how they learned, whether they enjoyed that process, and we tweak and we play with it, and then we take that and we bring it to the community, either to kids programs or to adults programs. And that's really important, to have a place that's safe to practice and to learn from each other. And I can, at the ending of every year, I thank our students for letting us do that. So as I said, there are some chalkboard-based elements. I do use PowerPoint, and we do write on the whiteboards. But there's a heavy emphasis on activity-based. And the other major element that I think we learned through this process is that if you can make education occur through community, it becomes transformative. So it's not just that you pick a particular activity and you all go out and do that activity and you use language within that activity, but that you make language a part of a thread that holds the community together, that helps the community function, and you've created a place that the language will be. The users of it will want to use the language in that context. It'll be a part of how they understand their relationship to each other. And once you do that, you've created space for it that it just starts to increase. And it also becomes teacher training 2.0. I think if you go back and you look at the people who attended the first teacher training funded by ANA, you can see most of those individuals taught for a few years, maybe 5 after that, but most are not teaching the language in the community anymore. And a part of that is their age, their ability to travel and commit the time to teach. So it's nothing about the experience necessarily, but a part of it was also about the experience, that they didn't get the same kind of education that our youth are getting in the heritage classes. And I think we have to admit the reality that the kinds of teachers we're producing through that process are very different. And as we engaged in youth programming, we very heavily relied on students coming out of the Heritage Award classes to serve as teachers in those programs. And they come to that then with already a fundamental understanding of all the other things I talked about. That yes, we're going to use the chalkboard sometime, but most of the language use is going to be in the context of community and the context of activity. And that they already have a sense of how that language helps tie them together. And it becomes very powerful to watch them interact with kids. The upside / downside to it is we end up with 30 kids who all want to come to Miami University every year. So, but that's a problem for Bobby to deal with later. And so that takes us to Ewan Zapata Nujongi Sipiwe. Originally we just called this Ewan Zapata because it was the only one, but now there's more than one. So we also refer to it in terms of where its place is. Nujongi Sipiwe in the Neosho River in Myaamiaki in Oklahoma. And here we make intentional planned efforts to begin the program around the idea of community. So it's structured first and foremost around community. This is the activity we begin every year's program with. Talking about the elements of community, talking about how these people are all related to each other, sometimes very, very closely, sometimes a little more distantly, but usually everyone in this group is related to each other. Maybe you have to go back 7 generations, but usually less than that. And the whole web of 30 people are related to each other. And it's a very powerful experience for children, many of whom grow up in diaspora. I'm going to make the assumption that most people in the audience know the basic outline of Miami history. If you don't, we can talk about it after my presentation on the side. But that most of our community today is centered in 3 places: in Oklahoma, in Miami, Oklahoma, in eastern Kansas, and in north central Indiana. And then from those 3 centers, families went into diaspora beginning in the 20th century. And so we have people living in 47 states, I think, right now. So these activities are very important to reconnect kids who are journeying back to their homelands, and then in a way journeying back to community. Here, education through community takes on new meaning. So in the first version of this program, it was an overnight camp, and it was without their parents. So this wasn't a family model, this was kids only. Kids were dropped off on a Sunday, and they stayed with us till Saturday, and they camped out on the land in Oklahoma. And then most of the life of the program was really centered on sustaining the community. So the amount of time we spent cooking, cleaning both dishes and bodies and tents, and cleaning up and organizing before and after activities vastly exceeded the time of the activities themselves, where you think the content is. But the language and the ideals of the program were actually throughout all of that. And so the functioning of the community of camp was the lesson. The themes were just the add-ons that occur each year. And they're important add-ons. I spent a lot of time developing them, and other people spent a lot of time helping build them. But without the underlying principle of community driving things, it wouldn't work, it would fall apart. And so this is a picture of the food line where we spend a lot of time focused on food. And if you know of our people's traditional lives, pre-contact and even through the most of the early years of contact, most of your daily life was spent thinking about, working on, and producing and processing food. And then thinking about helping and caring for your relatives. And that's what the education program becomes. For right now, as we continue to work to revitalize our language, a lot of the terminology that we have, a lot of the vocabulary that we have revitalized currently fits really well in that context, because that's where it lived for thousands of years. We have new words, we continue to create new terms, we continue to revitalize our language so it fits in this modern context, our contemporary lives, but it also fits really well within this nexus of community. That's where it lived since time immemorial. This youth program began in 2005. As I said, most of the counselors were from Miami University, and then most of the senior staff was a mix of Myaamia Project staff, as well as people like Wes and Scott Shoemaker coming from all over the country. The last thing I'll say about it is that it was always very hot. And the whole community had to work very hard to deal with heat. And it was an interesting, again, experience, a very powerful learning experience for kids who they didn't have an air-conditioned zone to go to. And they had to learn to deal with the environment in a very different way as a community. So it's now it produces fond memories until you're in it again in the next June. But the other lesson that we learned from this after doing it for numerous years is that it might not be completely sustainable at the numbers that we were drawing. So this program became very, very popular, which is a very, very good thing. But the problem is, as I said, the production of traditional food, the cleaning, the cooking, the living arrangements couldn't really sustain numbers greater than 25. And we were getting demands as high as like 40 students, and we could see it ever increasing. And we realized this model wasn't sustainable. It wasn't sustainable for the staff in terms of our own energy levels, and it probably wasn't sustainable for the kids in terms of what they would get out of it and how healthy they would be when they would come out at the end of the week. And so we needed to have other models that would also help meet the demands, the very positive demands that existed within the community. And those actually came out of the community. So here's where we begin to move into a different kind of planning. This is a picture from last year's Ewan Zapata Kihkayonge, the Ewan Zapata program in Kihkayonge, which is also Fort Wayne, Indiana. This is in a silver maple that sits outside the Richardville House, Pinjiwa Aweke, which just received National Historic Register status. And I call this Youth Program 2.0 because it's kind of a revision of the first one. This is a day camp model, so it's less intensive, less immersive, but also more sustainable. You can handle larger numbers of youth. And it also came out of community efforts. So that this came about because community members said, hey, we'd like to do something here. How can you help us do it? Rather than the Myaamia Project staff or other people in sort of a top-down way creating something, this was bottom-up. It was also supported and jointly administered by another group, great friends of ours at IPFW and the Three Rivers Institute, Chad Thompson. And that's through the work of the community members finding community partners to also help them. And so the resources become shared between multiple groups. What's interesting about this effort is that it's expandable, it's exportable, and it's customizable, so that other Myaamia groups across the country could adopt parts of this model themselves, seek out community partners, both within the Miami tribe community and within their local community, to try and create their own program that meets their own particular needs in their area while drawing on resources that the community is creating as a whole. I'm running short of time here, so I'll fly through the stuff that's in progress. You'll see a lot of this out in the tables. Our next effort is moving a lot of these resources into homes so that the kids who come to our programs, which begin at about 10 years old, already have exposure to the language, and then those who maybe can never make it to our programs have a lot of exposure. These are some of the resources, printed resources, as well as online resources. And you'll see the online resources as well as the printed outside that are on today. What I want to get to right here at the end is sort of the questions I have for my people, for them to think about, and when they feel ready for them to talk to anyone about, me or anybody else. The conversation doesn't have to be driven by me. These are just questions I have. You can, of course, abandon them and ask your own. And I ask myself, where are we at right now? Tanaha apiyangwe, where are we at? And what I see is a process, a feeder stream, and I'm watching an operation of that we have young people coming out of their homes who have Miami language and culture experience. They're learning from their parents. And those young kids are going into the Ewan Zapata programs at 10 years old, and they already know quite a bit of their history, language, and culture, and they're really primed to learn even more. And then some of those young people are already talking about coming to Miami University, where they'll then take heritage classes for 7 semesters, perhaps do independent study work, and then become the counselors and teachers at the youth programs, as well as the future parents creating home learning environments. So what I'm seeing is organically, without any real thought or planning, a feedback loop being created that creates the intergenerational mechanisms to build back up to a higher level of usage in whatever that is, however we define that success, as Wes said. But I see the mechanism for growth. And the growth's not within one generation, it's within multiple generations. Again, I define the standards of success as where are we going to be in 6 or 7 generations, not where are we today or where are we in 10 years. And then I asked, Myaamiaki, where are we going? Myaamiaki, where are we going, Miami people? And I have my own ideas about that. Some of this is my own thinking, and some of it is based on what I see organically occurring, and some of it is what I think might occur. That what we're doing right now is we're beginning to produce home learning that's for much younger kids, for the under 10 set. And that will be broken down into stages. From the time before a child is born, how parents prepare their house, onward. And then those young people will go to Ewan Zapata programs at 10 years old. And at 16, they're no longer, they've outgrown those programs. They can come back as junior counselors, but there's a limited number of spots for that. And so I eventually see the need for the development of a program that deals with 16 to 18-year-olds. And I see in that the context within which I personally could dedicate the energy to recreate the more intensive, week-long camp-out model, because you'd be dealing with smaller numbers, a higher teacher-to-student ratio, which leads to less food, less cooking, less cleaning, a better ability to adjust to your environment with a smaller group. And so that in there we regrow that very beneficial experience for those who have demonstrated an aptitude, an ability, and a desire to learn these things. And so I called that program Myaamiaki, and that's just a name I gave, which means noon, the noonday sun. It says someone's transferring from the rising sun, which is what Ewan Zapata means, to a latter stage of life. Ideally, and this is an ideal system, those young people would then go to Miami University. And what they would be prepared to do would be vastly different. The kinds of questions and ideas they would have would be vastly different than anything I can think of right now. Those young people would then graduate and in some way become a part of larger families, perhaps as parents, perhaps as aunts and uncles, perhaps as adopted parents. There's numerous different ways in which they could participate in the lives of other young people from birth onwards. And that in here we begin to approach, we call it the color of north, the color of wisdom, which is black. I can't know if they will have elder wisdom, so I kind of colored it as gray, but they will begin to approach that. And as parents then, they'll be better prepared, as caregivers for young people, in whatever form that takes, they'll be better prepared to create these home learning strategies, these home learning stages that begin again from the cradle onward. These are the 6 curricula that exist within Ewan Zapata. These are flexible, changeable, but right now that's what we have. So from 10 to 16, we can say this is what a youth coming to this program will experience. It can be changed, but one of the questions I have for our people is, what do we want our young people to know? What do we want them to be capable of doing? What do we want them to be capable of teaching, in a general sense? Right now, this is what we're doing, largely just through organic development. But there's a place within the nation to have a talk about that. Do we want to do something different? Do we want to do something that is all agreed upon? Do we want to just continue this organic fashion of education? I don't know. Many nations take direct responsibility for the education of the next generation, and they define and delineate what that should be, sometimes through laws, official codes, official curricula, sometimes through informal discussions, and anything in between. But some nations do that. Others know that they can leave it to the organic nature of the community, and it will thrive. I don't necessarily know the answer. What I do know is we can imagine stages, 6 or more, existing in all of these different areas. And we could have a pretty expansive body of knowledge that we could say our young people generally know this. They generally know this about their people. They generally can speak to this extent in their language. They generally can do these things in their environment. They generally can teach this to their children. I think that's a very strong likelihood. I'll end here. I think my goal, this is my individual goal as a teacher, is that what I hope for is the next generation of young people to create Miami homes in whatever way it is that they see fit, and that they recognize that space as Myaamia. I think that's the key. And so that their children, or the next generation of young people they help care for, if they don't have children themselves, can experience a continual evolution of Myaamia knowledge. Our knowledge didn't go away and disappear. Certain parts of it went into decline. Certain parts of it went to sleep. Certain parts of it are still dormant. Certain parts of it expanded and grew to a great extent. And what we want is the conditions under which we can choose what we want to revitalize and reclaim, choose what we want to leave sleeping, and then continue to evolve so that our people can go from Tekanal Kanengonje, Ya Yangwe from the cradle, Ya Yangwe Achapai Kanungishe, to the Milky Way, which many of us describe as a collection of the fires of our ancestors. To me, I see it as a visual representation of the wisdom of hundreds of generations of Miami people that we as a community all have a right to and a responsibility for. So, Mission Newe, I'll stop there, and I don't know if I have any time left for questions, but.